By the late 1970s and early 80s, the IRA had been reinvigorated by a new generation of leaders. Gone were the stuffy old higher-ups of the past, and in their place was a much more aggressive, colder and calculating chain of command that would see far more widespread violence, with a particular focus on mainland Britain, with a gradual shift in focus towards sectarian attacks on their Protestant enemies, rather than purely against Crown forces. They now had the men, the materials, and the determination to wage an indefinite war of attrition against their perceived British oppressors, and yet at the same time still sought to achieve their aims peacefully at the ballot box, a two-pronged approach that would divide opinion on both sides of the Irish Sea. But in 1979, the British would also find new leadership, their first female Prime Minister, and she was not going to take their demands lying down. The Iron Lady was not for turning. But as this new era dawned, the IRA were about to strike right at the very heart of the British establishment, with devastating results. So join us as Descent into Darkness examines the second phase of the Troubles, that the Provisional IRA dubbed the Long War. And I shall begin this episode with an admission that I forgot to include this section in part 1 of this series, so I shall make amends now with the Shankill Butchers. Spilling over from the previous decade, we shall look at the most notorious Loyalist cell who brought new previously unseen levels of savagery to the conflict. Mostly made up from members of the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF, the Shankill Butchers would end up being responsible for at least 23 exceedingly violent murders between 1975 to early 1977, but were suspected to have killed at least 30. They became notorious for kidnap, torture and mutilation of their victims, who were usually killed by cutting their throats. Taking their name from the Loyalist stronghold of the Shankill Road in Belfast, the gang was headed up by Lenny Murphy, an exceedingly dangerous and ruthless individual, who even during his school years was renowned for his extreme bullying and threats towards other children in his peer group. He joined the UVF at the age of 16 in 1968, where he soon cemented his reputation, marking himself out as someone who got results. He mostly stayed clear of the law by attending the trials of fellow Loyalist paramilitary suspects, where he paid close attention to how the law worked and the weight of evidence used in court. But this would not save him from the long arm of the law, as in 1972, when he was just 20 years old, he was arrested for shooting and killing 32-year-old William Pavis after breaking into his home. This would result in him being tried for the crime, but the jury acquitted him on a technicality, despite two witnesses claiming to have seen him pulling the trigger and subsequently picking him out from a police lineup. But he would not remain free for long, as he was rearrested a short time after and interned for 3 years without trial for numerous escape attempts from Crumlin Road Prison. He was released in 1975 and immediately set about recruiting his own squad from the pubs on the Shankill Road. These included his brother John and 2 of his friends, William Moore and Robert Basher Bates. They operated out of the upper floor flat of the Brown Bear pub, which stood on the corner of Mountjoy Road and Shankill. Moore had previously held a job in a meat processing factory, from which he had stolen a number of meat cleavers and other large knives, which he made available for the rest of the gang. One of their first crimes of their killing spree took place on the 2nd of October 1975, when they raided an off-license, that's a liquor store for my American viewers, where Murphy shot 3 of the 4 employees himself after learning that they were Catholics, and then ordering one of his underlings to kill the 4th one. After this, they spent some time stalking the streets close to known Catholic areas, looking for someone they could abduct. Sadly, at around 20 to 1 on the morning of the 25th of November, they spotted a prime target, a 34-year-old man named Francis Crossin. Crossin was spotted by the gang on Library Street, Belfast, as they travelled around in Moore's car, a black London-style taxicab. They pulled up alongside him, whereupon Murphy leaped out of the vehicle and struck Crossin on the head with a tire iron, knocking him unconscious, before bundling him into the boot of the car and speeding away. Francis Crossin's body was discovered the next morning by an old lady in an alleyway just off the Shankill Road. He had been severely beaten and had been mutilated with knives and broken bottles. Murphy had then cut his throat with a large butcher's knife, severing all the tissues right down to the vertebra. The damage to his body was so bad that the family were forced to have a closed casket at his funeral. 5 days after Crossin's murder, Murphy and his gang became involved in an internal dispute within the UVF that resulted in the killings of a handful of members of both rival factions. Murphy took part in one of these executions himself, beating and shooting Noel Shaw at the Lawnbrook Social Club that the UVF used as one of their HQs. Shaw's body was thrown into a large laundry basket, which William Moore then drove away in his black cab to dump about half a mile away. In February of 1976, two more men, 55-year-old Thomas Quinn and 24-year-old Francis Rice, were abducted and killed by Murphy's crew in a similar manner to that of Francis Crossin, their bodies being discovered shortly after. This led to widespread panic amongst the Catholic community at the thought of a Protestant death squad snatching people off the street and brutally murdering them. This was when the first use of the gang's gruesome moniker, the Shankill Butchers, began to be used. The RUC got a lead from a witness who claimed to have seen a black cab in the same area that Francis Rice's body was found. This led to Moore being questioned as to his whereabouts on the night of the 22nd of February. Of course, Moore kept his mouth shut, and he had already cleaned his car thoroughly, meaning that no evidence was found. Still, out of caution, Murphy ordered Moore to destroy the cab, which he did, replacing it with a yellow Ford Cortina instead. But in early March, Murphy was arrested on suspicion of murder, also finding illegally held firearms at his home. Sadly, there wasn't enough evidence to conclusively link him to the killings, but he did plead guilty to the firearms charge, for which he was sentenced to 12 years in October of 1976. But even whilst in the jug, Murphy was still calling the shots, doling out orders to Moore, who regularly visited him. These orders included the resumption of the abduction and throat cuttings to divert suspicion away from Murphy. Under Moore's seemingly capable de facto leadership, the gang had already murdered another man, 49-year-old Cornelius Neeson, whom they had killed with a hatchet on the 1st of August whilst Murphy was still being held on remand. The butchery continued from the 30th of October with the murder of 20-year-old Stephen McCann. This was then followed up on the 3rd of February the next year with the murders of 52-year-old Joseph Morrissey and 43-year-old Francis Cassidy on the 30th of March, all of whom had been subjected to extreme levels of violence before their throats were slashed. On the 10th of May, another man, Gerard McClaverty, was abducted from the Cliftonville Road and was beaten and cut, but uncharacteristically, his throat was not cut. They still left him for dead in an alleyway, but by some minor miracle, he was able to stay alive through the night, being discovered the next morning when a woman passing by the spot heard his moans and pleas for help. McClaverty was treated for his wounds and was able to survive his ordeal. On the 18th of May, only a week after his attack, McClaverty was driven around the Shankill Road area in an unmarked car by Chief Investigator Jimmy Nesbitt, hoping that he would catch a glimpse of his assailants. Thankfully, McClaverty spotted two of them, named McAllister and Edwards. The very next day, Nesbitt and his team swooped in and arrested most of the gang's members, including Moore, McAllister and Edwards. The murder trial of the Shankill Butchers was held throughout 1978 and into 79, with guilty verdicts being handed down to all. Amongst the 11 men on trial, a total of 42 life sentences were imposed, the most ever given out in a single case by a British court. However, Basher Bates, who pleaded guilty to 10 murders, was released in 1994, and Moore, who was found guilty of 11 killings, was released in 1998 under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, despite both men receiving whole-life orders. Lenny Murphy was released from prison in mid-July of 1982, but he would meet his end at the hands of the IRA in November of 1982. Of course, there is far more to the story of the Shankill Butchers than this, but I shall leave it there for a future dedicated deep dive video. The murder of Lord Mountbatten. The IRA struck a huge blow against the British establishment in the summer of 1979 when it killed a much-loved member of the royal family. Earl Louis Mountbatten, cousin to Queen Elizabeth II, had held many esteemed government and military roles in his time, including First Sea Lord of the Admiralty, and was the last Viceroy and Governor-General of India before their independence. Now, in his twilight years, he had completely moved away from public life and spent his summers at Classybourne Castle near the small town of Mullaghmore, County Sligo. He loved nothing more than to take his family and friends out in his small 30-foot motor launch named Shadow 5 for a jaunt up and down the wild Irish western coast or for a spot of fishing. However, the tranquil peace of Mullaghmore would be shattered in the early morning of the 27th of August 1979. The previous evening, IRA man Thomas McMahon had snuck aboard his boat to plant a large 50-pound radio-controlled bomb. They knew roughly what time he would be heading out the next day, and had timed the explosion perfectly. Only 16 minutes after Mountbatten's small entourage of family and local friends, including his eldest daughter and her husband, Lady and Lord Brabourne, their twin sons, Nicholas and Timothy, both aged 14, Lord Brabourne's mother, the Dowager Lady Brabourne, aged 83, and 15-year-old local boy, Paul Maxwell, from Enniskillen in County Fermanagh, who had been hired for the summer to be Mountbatten's boat boy, had cast off from the quay, and then a few minutes later, the bomb exploded. There would be only 3 survivors, Lord and Lady Brabourne, and one of their sons, Timothy. The Dowager Lady Brabourne was rescued and brought ashore, but died of her injuries the next day. This attack sent shockwaves through Britain. The whole country was thoroughly appalled by this cowardly attack on the elder statesman and his family. It was almost the equivalent of killing Churchill. But in Mountbatten's private diaries, it was later discovered that he in fact held some sympathies with the Irish Republican cause, which came as quite a surprise to the man who had sanctioned the bombing, Rory O'Brady, by that point a former twice Chief of Staff of the IRA and then President of Sinn Fein. When he was presented with this information, he expressed regret at having ordered the operation and felt that if Mountbatten's feelings had been known at the time, attempts would have been made to approach him as a potential ally to the Republican cause. On an interesting side note on O'Brady, an old friend of mine, now sadly deceased, Longford-born legend Richard Latimer Hackett, his family used to own a PA hire company. The Hacketts were Church of Ireland and so had no horse in the race of Irish independence, and so would gladly hire out to both sides for their rallies. At one point, Ricky's dad began getting harassed by local Republicans who felt that he shouldn't be letting the Unionists use his equipment. O'Brady, also being a Longford man, would often come around for tea and cake. Old man Hackett told him of the trouble he was getting, to which O'Brady asked if he could use their phone. He made his way out to the hallway, and after a couple of minutes and raised voice coming from the hall, O'Brady came back in and sat down. He smiled and picked up his brew and said, "Sure you'll have no trouble anymore." "I know you can't hear me, Ricky, but thanks for that wee anecdote. I really miss you, fella. Keep a large whiskey and a fat joint ready for me when I see you again, you loudmouth bollocks. I'll bring the steaks and the guitars." Only a few hours later, after Mountbatten's boat went up, the IRA ambushed a patrol of paratroopers with the roadside bomb at a place called Narrow Water near Warrenpoint, County Down. All were killed. When the army got wind of the explosion, they sent out more men to contain the scene. When they approached the site of the bomb, a second device went off. A total of 18 soldiers lost their lives at the Warrenpoint bombing. This would be the British force's highest loss of life in a single day throughout the whole of the Troubles. By the end of the day of the 27th of August 1979, the death toll for the conflict to that date stood at 2,154 soldiers, police and civilians. Hunger strike. As mentioned in the previous episode, the policy of internment had already caused huge backlash amongst the Republican community. Most of the ire would be directed at the so-called H-blocks of Long Kesh, where many Republican agitators and suspected IRA men, including Gerry Adams, would be imprisoned without trial. But by far the one name that comes to mind when one thinks of Long Kesh Internment Centre is former IRA commander Bobby Sands. In 1980, Sands and fellow prisoners demanded to be reclassified as political prisoners, which would have granted them much better conditions. The then Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher flatly denied this request. In response, the internees carried out numerous types of protests, including refusal to wear prison-issued clothing, covering themselves instead with blankets, this being known as the blanket protest, and so-called dirty protests, by which they would not use the toilet in their cells and smear the walls with their own excrement. And, the most impactful of all, hunger strike. On the 27th of October 1980, 7 prisoners refused food until they were granted political status. By December, the British government appeared to relent on their stance, but not long after the hunger strike was called off, the British reneged. And so, on the 1st of March 1981, Bobby Sands, who had risen to be leader of the interned IRA members, began another hunger strike. This caused a huge media sensation, with news outlets providing constant updates and speculation on Sands' well-being. This put huge pressure on Margaret Thatcher, but still she would not budge, claiming variously, quote, "That's what political status means, special privileges for having done cold, callous, brutal murder." And, "We are not prepared to consider special category status for certain groups of people serving sentences for crime. Crime is crime is crime. It is not political." It is highly likely that Mrs. Thatcher's hardline stance against the IRA was born out of the 1979 murder of her political mentor, Airey Neave. Neave had been the one to coach her through her early years as an MP, and his murder via a car bomb absolutely devastated Thatcher, who called Neave her greatest friend. A huge political coup was struck for the IRA by the timely by-election in the constituency of Fermanagh and South Tyrone. Sands' name was added to the ballot, and he won. But sadly for Bobby, the lady truly wasn't for turning. Political status never came, and Bobby Sands died from starvation 66 days into his hunger strike. His funeral was attended by 100,000 people. Gerry Adams was one of the pallbearers. 3 men in balaclavas stepped forward with rifles to fire a 3-volley salute over the coffin. 9 more men would die on hunger strike before the protest was called off. Thatcher had stood strong, and won, but had become the figure of intense hatred, something she would later have to get used to by all those who fell victim to her various domestic policies too. The huge wave of hate towards Mrs. Thatcher and the British establishment and the Republican support that her stance had whipped up served to offer the IRA a whole new field of conflict, a much more peaceful means: politics. If they couldn't get what they wanted by fighting for it, then they could try voting for it. The election of Bobby Sands showed that there was widespread support for a political solution, and Sinn Fein were ready to take advantage of that. But this strategy risked splitting the IRA once again, as it had done in 1968 to create the Provisional IRA. This led to infighting within the Republican movement that saw yet more deaths on both sides, battling for ideological control of the campaign. Tommy McKierney, a fellow internee who was on the same wing as Sands, said of the shift in attitude towards the ballot box at the time, "When Bobby Sands was elected, those within the movement who had long been worried or skeptical or hesitant about engaging in electoral strategy, here was clear evidence that there was a potential for success. I believed that eventually there would be a conflict of interest between the political electoral strategy and the armed campaign. It is not possible to run a parliamentary campaign while attempting to overthrow the same state that you're hoping to manage." Incidentally, and this is a bit of a side rant from yours truly here, a famous picture taken at Bobby Sands' funeral was pricked up by the British right during Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party from 2015 to 2020. There had been claims that Corbyn was sympathetic to the IRA cause, despite him being a long-time pacifist, so how would that work exactly? But this photograph appeared to show someone who looked the dead spit of Corbyn in the crowd stood next to Gerry Adams. However, this is not the case. The man in the photo was Owen Carron, Sands' campaign manager. But anyway, rant over. Later that year, on the 10th of October, the IRA would strike on British home soil once more, when a nail bomb was left outside of the Chelsea Army barracks. This attack would result in the death of 2 civilians and injured around 50. The American Connection. It is little surprise that many US-Irish immigrants felt sympathy for their kinfolk back home, and with the USA being a ready source of available firearms, especially before the assault weapons ban, it was felt by the IRA that they should make every effort to get whatever they could. The IRA's main contact in the States was George Harrison. No, not that George Harrison. This one. Originally born in County Mayo in Eire, the expat Harrison had emigrated to the USA in the late 1930s. Harrison would meet with top Republicans such as Martin McGuinness, to outline the need to secure weapons for the armed campaign. Harrison met with his contacts at his home in Brooklyn to secure a shipment of arms, amongst them a pair of scoped Ruger Mini 14 rifles. However, little did they know, but the FBI was listening and were the ones playing Harrison with undercover agents and round-the-clock observations, hoping to sting him. They had wiretapped the room in which they met and had hid a tracking device inside the stock of one of the Ruger guns. But it was the FBI who would blink first. Paranoia had set in that the weapons were about to be moved, and so, in a fit of panic, the feds decided to swoop in. Harrison was arrested and tried for gun-running charges. More raids uncovered a massive cache of weapons ready to be shipped to Northern Ireland, including more small arms such as the US M16A1, Ruger Mini 14s, old M1 Garans and M1 carbines, a 20mm aircraft cannon with ammunition, and even flamethrowers. An even bigger coup in these raids was the arrest of former IRA Chief of Staff Joe Cahill, who had been on the run since being released after the seizure of the freighter Claudia off the south coast of Ireland in 1973. Using various disguises to slip through the net, Cahill had been staying with Harrison whilst the negotiations for the arms shipments went on and had been attending secret fundraisers for Irish Americans sympathetic to the cause with an organisation called NORAID. NORAID was set up by Michael Flannery, who became the de facto moneyman for the IRA's fundraising in the States. During their raid on a NORAID fundraising event, the FBI were able to arrest both Cahill and Flannery. The subsequent trial became something of a showpiece for the cause, demonstrating just how much fervent support had been whipped up in the States, particularly because of the hunger strikes. The defense even arrogantly claimed that the prosecution's assertion that their client had been running guns for 9 months was a bloody lie, as they had in fact been doing it for the last 30 years, even holding up a raft of evidence to that effect and slamming them down on the table. They then went on to claim that their work was an act of resistance against British tyranny, and that, as their contact for the guns was a CIA agent, they were on US government business. This went far beyond any admission of guilt. It was a statement of defiance, turning a gun-running case into a political struggle, a landmark legal case that sent shockwaves through the Irish-American community, drumming up even more support for NORAID. Astoundingly, on the 5th of November 1982, all the indicted defendants were ultimately found not guilty. Upon reading of the verdicts, even the clerk of the court stood up and began chanting, "IRA! IRA! All the way!" until he was pulled from the courtroom and reminded that he was supposed to be working for the man. The defendants walked free from the court to tumultuous cheers from those assembled. George Harrison even sardonically remarked, "Hey, I want my guns back." The huge gamble had paid off in the most spectacular way. They had admitted to their crimes and had even exposed far more in the process, but had still all been acquitted. Can you imagine trying that in any other court case? By the very same day that Harrison and his co-defendants walked free, the death toll of the Troubles had grown to 2,475. The following year, Mrs. Thatcher's government was re-elected with a still healthy majority, but crucially, one of the seats went to Gerry Adams as the MP for West Belfast. Of course, he stuck with the time-honoured Sinn Fein tradition of abstentionism from taking his seat in Westminster, but that didn't matter. It was still a great coup for the party, and by extension, the IRA. When Adams was asked by a journalist, following his victory, "Do you think that now for the Republican movement, perhaps the way forward should be the ballot box, should be constitutional politics?" Adams replied, "That's the question that has to be put to the British government. If they listen to the ballot box, then no one will be reaching out for the Armalite." But even as Adams was being carried aloft through the streets of Belfast to rapturous cheers, the IRA was in the process of re-establishing a US gun-running network to get hold of more weapons for the long war. Ex-New York-born US Marine John Crawley had left the US forces specifically to join the IRA. His orders from the Army Council were to set up a new line of supply. They didn't care how he did it, but he must get weapons. This time, the emphasis shifted from New York to Boston. A contact handed him a $5 bill that was cut in a specific way. The man he was to meet had the other half of the bill. That man was Patrick Nee, a member of the Boston Irish mob, and close associate of notorious boss James Whitey Bulger. The IRA was going into business with the Irish Mafia. Crawley described Bulger's attitude and the atmosphere around him thusly. "The joke around here was that when Whitey walked into a bar, all the beer went flat. You know, he had that type of effect on things. There was no joy in the man. That's what I'm trying to say." With a deal worth around $1.2 million over 2 years, including the $400,000 purchase of a boat named Valhalla, the Irish mob prepared to supply arms to the IRA from the quiet port town of Gloucester, just north of Boston. In late September of 1984, a 7-ton shipment of weapons was somehow loaded onto the Valhalla under the cover of darkness in total secrecy. Whitey Bulger was in the car nearby, listening in to police radio traffic to make sure the operation went undetected. The fully laden Valhalla slipped her moorings at first light and headed out into the North Atlantic. 3,000 miles later, they were off the coast of County Kerry in Eire. But sadly, for the IRA, an informant working for the Garda's Special Branch had rumbled the operation, and the RAF had been covertly tracking the boat all the way and monitored her radio traffic. Once the arms had been transferred aboard an Irish trawler, the Irish Navy swooped in and intercepted the shipment. Another attempt had been thwarted, just like Joe Cahill's shipment from Libya had been in 1975. Hundreds of M16 and derivative rifles, light and heavy machine guns, ammunition, and hand grenades were seized. It was a huge blow for the rebels. But only 2 years later, they hit back at the establishment with one of the most infamous events of the conflict that struck right at the very heart of the British government. The London Park bombings. The war would continue unabated, despite the infighting in the IRA, and once again the group would strike on British home soil. On the 20th of July 1982, 2 car bombs were set off in the middle of the day in 2 of London's major public spaces, Hyde and Regent's Park. The first one went off in Regent's Park at 10:43. The device had been hidden in a blue Morris Marina parked on South Carriage Drive, which was obliterated by the huge blast from around 25 pounds of gelignite, with nails packed around it for maximum damage. A huge charge that sent nails and other bits of shrapnel in every direction. At the time of the explosion, a detachment of the Queen's Own Bodyguard, the Household Cavalry Blues and Royals, were passing by for one of the daily changing of the guard ceremonies. In all, 11 were killed in this attack, including 4 men of the Blues and Royals. 7 of the regiment's horses died too. But the day was far from over, and only a short distance away, another bomb was slowly ticking down its timer. In Hyde Park, another bomb had been placed underneath a bandstand. At the time, a military band of the Royal Green Jackets were playing to a crowd of little over 100 bystanders as part of a whole day of regimental band displays. At 12:55, the timer ran out, and the bomb went up. This one did not contain nails, but still, the damage was significant. 6 of the Green Jackets were killed instantly, while another would succumb to his wounds 11 days later. Around 28 were injured, including 7 civilians. Clearly, these bombs had been targeted at military personnel. It is astounding that not more were killed, considering the size of the charges. The IRA were quick off the mark to claim responsibility for the attacks, although there was very little doubt in the first place. They taunted Margaret Thatcher by echoing a segment of a speech that she gave when Britain had declared war on Argentina for their surprise invasion of the Falkland Islands only a few months previous. The Irish people have sovereign and national rights, which no task or occupational force can put down. Never one to be outdone, Thatcher fired back with her own scathing rebuttal. These callous and cowardly crimes have been committed by evil, brutal men who know nothing of democracy. We shall not rest until they are brought to justice. One of the horses that, despite his wounds, survived the Regent's Park bomb, ridden by Sergeant Michael Pedersen, and named Sefton, that would go on to enjoy something of a celebrity status, winning Horse of the Year and appearing on a few television segments. Sadly for Sergeant Pedersen, the subsequent years would not be kind to him, as he developed severe PTSD from the incident, which would ultimately leading to him divorcing from his wife and then stabbing and killing his 2 children, before he ended his own life, in September of 2012. But speaking of horses, the abduction of Shergar. There have been many mysterious disappearances throughout British history that we simply have no definitive explanation for. Jack the Ripper, the crew of the Marie Celeste, and the eventual whereabouts of John Bingham, the Lord Lucan. And amongst these great vanishings lies that of a racehorse named Shergar. Mostly owned by the Aga Khan, along with other syndicate members, Shergar was something of a hot ticket in the racing world, having won the Guardian Classic Trial, Chester Vase, the Epsom Derby, by 10 lengths, the largest margin in that race's history, the Irish Sweeps Derby, the King George VI, and the Queen Elizabeth Stakes, all in the same year of 1981, being ridden alternately by the legendary jockeys Lester Piggott and Walter Swinburne. In thanks for his sterling service, and because he had disappointingly come fourth in his last race, Shergar was retired from racing and sent to a stud farm in Ballymenny, County Kildare. He had successfully sired 36 foals from 44 covers in his first year of stud. His second year had him fully booked out with 55 mares to cover. Player! This would have seen at least £1 million returned for his sexual conquest, not a bad paycheck for a year's worth of essentially being a fuckboy. But sadly, his mare-boning career would be cut short on the night of the 8th of February, 1982. At around 20:30, 3 armed men in balaclavas broke into the house of the farm's head groom, Jim Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald said that the men were not rough with him, but were very clear in their demands. "We've come for Shergar. We want $2 million for him." The rest of Jim's family were locked in a room of the house, whilst the men took Jim with them to the stables to find the prize stallion. They gently chivied him into a waiting horse box that another group of men had brought down, along with another van, around 6 to 9 men in total. They then took Jim with them and bundled him into the back of the van and ordered him to lie face down on the floor, and they then threw a coat over his head and drove away. Around 20 miles from the farm near Kilcock, the masked men stopped the van and ejected Jim Fitzgerald from the back, pointing a gun at his face. They warned him not to contact the Gardaí, or they would return for his family, and that they would be in touch about how he could get the horse back. They would use the code word King Neptune, before speeding away in a cloud of dust. Jim walked to the next village where he was able to phone his brother to come and pick him up. Later that evening, before the alarm had been raised, the horse nappers made a call to the horse trainer Jeremy Maxwell, demanding 40 grand, which would later rise to 52, a bit of a climb down from the initial 2 million. The callers said that they would negotiate the release of Shergar only with 3 particular racing journalists, who they told to have them meet at the Europa Hotel in Belfast in 4 days' time. The 3 journalists, Derek Thompson, John Oaksey and Peter Campling, arrived at the hotel at the appointed hour, whereupon they received another call instructing them to go to Jeremy Maxwell's house and await further instructions. Thompson tried to stall for time so the police could trace the line, but the caller rang off before the trace could be completed. Later that evening, the horse nappers called Maxwell's house. This time they managed to keep the caller on the line for enough time to have the location traced, but in something of a farcical turn-up for the books, the guy who was supposed to trace the calls had finished his shift and had pissed off home for the night. On the 9th, the thieves contacted the stud farm in Ballymenny and asked to speak to a man named Drion. Unfortunately, Drion was French and had a very poor command of English with a very thick accent, which caused much confusion between the two parties. But eventually, they managed to get through the message that they wanted £2 million for the return of the horse, and asked for the phone number of the Aga Khan's office in France so they could negotiate the exchange. Strangely, they demanded that part of the ransom be paid in £100 notes, a denomination that does not exist in British currency, so quite how they were supposed to do that is something of a mystery. They were also of the mistaken opinion that the Aga Khan was the sole owner of the horse, despite the fact that there were a total of 35 individual stakeholders of the animal. On the 11th, the authorities that had taken over negotiations demanded proof that Shergar was still alive. The thieves said that one of them should go to the Crofton Hotel in Dublin and ask the front desk for a message for a Johnny Logan. A man named Stan Cosgrove elected to run the errand, but when he got to the hotel, there was no message waiting. The thieves had seen that Cosgrove was accompanied by armed detectives and had backed out. A follow-up call threatened that if any cops escorted the runner again, they would murder all of them. They then said that they had left proof at the Rosnary Hotel for them. The envelope contained a few Polaroids of Shergar, with a copy of that day's Irish Times newspaper next to him. It was found that the photos were most definitely of the stolen horse, but it was not definitive proof that he was still alive. The negotiators told the thieves of their skepticism, but the response was simply, "If you're not satisfied, then that's it," and hung up the phone. But another call came in at 0700 on the 12th, reporting that Shergar had died. Some mooted the idea that this call may have been a hoax, but the caller had used the King Neptune code word, so it is highly unlikely that it was a prank. During the Garda's investigation, despite not finding any trace of the thieves or the vehicles they used, they did manage to stumble across quite a few IRA arms caches, which is still a good thing, but of course not what they were supposed to be looking for. 2 weeks after the theft, confidence in finding and recovering Shergar alive were waning, and so the investigation was scaled back, although not fully called off. Sadly, the famous horse, or the people who stole him, were never found, and it remains one of the greatest mysteries to this day. Despite their usual speed to admit responsibility to its various crimes, the IRA have always denied that they had anything to do with Shergar's abduction. Certainly, the men involved in the heist didn't say that they were with the IRA. Yet in 1999, Sean O'Callaghan, a high-level informant known as a supergrass, claimed that the organisation had in fact spirited the stallion away. He further claimed that, to the best of his knowledge, Shergar's remains were buried somewhere near Enniskillen in County Leitrim. There have been several horse skeletons brought to the attention of authorities that have claimed to be the one of the stolen animal, but none have ever been authenticated. It is almost certain that Shergar was killed and disposed of sometime soon after the abduction, but as a record-holding horse, he is right up there with Red Rum. In 1999, a special cup named the Shergar Cup was inaugurated, with the race being held at Goodwood and then later being moved to Ascot. The War of Secrets. Throughout the conflict, both sides engaged in espionage activities. Previously, during the 70s, a 21-year-old woman named Dolores Price, the driver and member of a cell known as the Unknowns, was the person ordered to pick up and take suspected British informants to their place of execution. She stated that her orders always came directly from Gerry Adams. It had been Adams' idea to disappear these people, although in an interview, Price said she could never understand why this was the case, when surely you would want to make an example of them. One such example was that of Jean McConville, a widow and mother of 10 children, who was abducted in December of 1972 on suspicion of passing information to the army, and was driven away by Dolores Price to her date with Destiny, where she was shot and buried in a shallow grave on Shelling Hill Beach, a few miles from Green Ore. Jean's body would not be recovered for around 30 years, when she finally was given a proper funeral. But the disappearances did virtually nothing to stop the leak of information. If anything, as the years went on, it only got worse. But it had led to the command structure of the IRA to be reorganised from the old column system to the active service unit system. The ASUs were able to operate autonomously and were comprised of very small groups of fighters who were not aware of other ASUs' actions or whereabouts, which made it far harder for informants to penetrate. The Thatcher government appointed former head of MI6, Maurice Oldfield, to study the new structure of the IRA, who concluded that without sensitive information passed from covert sources close to the very top or from the inside of the ASUs, the ability to predict their actions would be nigh on impossible. The reorganisation of the IRA structure had also created a new body to root out anyone suspected of passing information to the British. This was the much-feared Internal Security Unit, known by the more menacing nickname the Nutting Squad, from their penchant for execution-style killings. The Nutting Squad was headed up by Freddie Scappaticci, the man ultimately responsible for weeding out informers. But what the IRA didn't know is that Scappaticci, for the entirety of his time at the head of the Nutting Squad, and even before that, was secretly working as a double agent for the British under the code name Steak Knife. The man charged with protecting the IRA was actively working to achieve its downfall. Scappaticci had been recruited by British intelligence during internment at Long Kesh, having previously been charged with riotous assembly. Stakeknife was to become the top mole in the IRA, where he was allowed a free rein to operate as he saw fit to maintain his cover, including the killing of innocent people. This led to a 2-year-long rampage beginning in 1980 that would see the Nutting Squad kill more IRA members than the British did. Unlike the previous idea of disappearing suspected traitors, the Nutting Squad were far more public, leaving their victims out in the open to be easily found a short while later as a very loud warning to all not to talk to the British. By the 11th of November 1982, when the Nutting Squad's reign of terror began to calm, the total number of deaths in the Troubles stood at 2,481. The insular nature of the active service units did not, however, apply to the Nutting Squad. They knew full well the activities and locations of every single ASU and their members. The British intelligence forces must have been rubbing their hands with glee once they realised that Stakeknife could get to anyone at any time on the flimsiest of pretexts. He was even tasked with vetting all new recruits and sat on the Army Council. Everything went through Freddie Scappaticci, giving him the greatest insight into the whole operation from the top to bottom. A spy's dream scenario. Gerry Adams has always denied ever being in the IRA, but this is greatly at odds with the testimonies of former members such as Dolores Price and Desmond Long, a man who sat on the Army Council for over 17 years. In an interview for the BBC, he categorically rubbished Adams' claim of never being in the IRA, even counterclaiming that Adams was in fact, by his release from Long Kesh in 1977, the chairman of the Army Council, saying, "You can't be on the Army Council unless you're a volunteer, and you can't be chairman of the Army Council unless you're a member of the Army Council." When interviewer Dara McIntyre replied, "But Adams wasn't in the IRA," Long replied, "That's a lie. And I'm saying it now as someone who sat across from him in meetings. I'll probably get shot for it, but I'm saying it." So who do you believe? A man who potentially has something to hide, or the man who has nothing to lose? I'll let you decide that in the comments. The British Army's intel was handled by the Forced Research Unit, or FRU, formed in 1982. They worked closely with the SAS, but maintained a distant relationship with the RUC and the wider British Army. It was the FRU that handled Freddie Stakeknife Scappaticci as their top agent in the theatre. Along with Stakeknife, they also recruited Brian Nelson to collude with the Loyalist paramilitary group, Ian Paisley's Ulster Defence Association, or UDA. The UDA would be used as an entirely legal body to act against the IRA until it was finally proscribed in 1992. The FRU were supposed to inform the RUC when they heard of an IRA operation going down, but most of the time they failed to pass on the information. Many civilians and RUC officers died because of the FRU's inaction. Brian Nelson was a former British Army soldier and the leader of the UDA's intelligence unit, and had been recruited to the FRU during his time in prison for the torture and attempted murder of a partially sighted Catholic man. Under the FRU's guidance, Nelson reorganised the UDA into a much more efficient beast that could be called upon to do the FRU's dirty work when necessary to avoid having the fingerprints of the British forces on a particular murder or attack, essentially using these paramilitaries as their own private death squad, all with the blessing of the British High Command. Certainly, murders by the UDA increased exponentially once Nelson had become the head of their intelligence unit. The FRU did not just rely on Stakeknife for their information, however. They had a whole network of individuals scattered throughout the IRA, ranging from high to low, who would pass them reliable leads. The more important of these people became known as supergrasses, to grass being a vernacular phrase meaning to inform to the authorities, similar to a snitch. At one point in 1987, the UDA became aware of the existence of Stakeknife, but not totally sure who it was. To protect their golden goose, the FRU fed information to Nelson that Stakeknife was an interned man named Francisco Notarantonio, who was subsequently murdered, being shot in his bed at his Ballymurphy home. Alongside the FRU were two other bodies involved in intelligence gathering and counter-espionage, the Special Branch of the RUC and MI5, but these bodies were less concerned about deep cover agents and more in the way of preventing crime, arresting or outright eliminating IRA members where they could. The Frew even actively encouraged Nelson to seek out supplies of weapons from South Africa to arm the UDA and other Loyalist groups, even footing the bill for his flights and accommodation. The RUC did attempt to approach Nelson for their own purposes, claiming that with their help he could reach the very top of the UDA leadership and work alongside 3 other agents they had already working for him, but Nelson declined. One time when the Frew did make a move to prevent an attack on the RUC came on the night of the 8th of May 1987. From intelligence gathered, the Frew were able to pass information to the SAS of an impending attack on the RUC barracks at Loch Awe, County Armagh. At around 19:15 on the evening of the 8th, a digger with a large 300 to 400 pound bomb in its forward bucket was driven by members of an 8-man active service unit, the rest following in a Toyota van. The ASU was based in West Tyrone and was known to have been one of the most prolific and ruthless units of the whole theatre. The digger broke through the perimeter fence and drove up to the side of the building, whereupon the bomb was detonated. The explosion destroyed around half of the barrack building, but it had already been evacuated. Just then, the SAS struck. They ambushed the rebel unit, and in short order and in a hail of automatic fire, all of the ASU were dead, with only 1 minor casualty in return. 1 civilian passerby was sadly caught in the crossfire, also being killed. But the fact that the entire IRA unit had been wiped out in a single stroke made it the worst single loss of life for the rebels of the whole conflict. Upon examination of the bullet-riddled bodies, it was found that 2 of them were unarmed, but still, it probably wouldn't have taken much more for them to lift a gun from one of their comrades. Weapons recovered from the dead include 2 H&K G3 rifles, 1 FN-FAL, 2 FN-FNCs, 1 Frankie SPAS-12 shotgun, and a Ruger Security 6 revolver, demonstrating just how varied and extensive the IRA's weaponry was, although the revolver had actually been looted from a dead RUC officer who was killed 2 years previously. Ballistic tests were carried out on the recovered guns, and they were found to have been used in as many as 44 other previous attacks collectively. The funeral of the 8 men was attended, of course, by Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, who acted as pallbearers for one of the coffins. The dead were hailed as martyrs. IRA intelligence officer Kieran Conway said in a later interview that the failed attack sent shockwaves through the organisation, but the one question lingering on their minds were, how did the British know the attack was coming? This then meant that great lengths were taken to try and weed out anyone who was even mildly suspected of having been an informant. Unfortunately for the IRA, that job was handed to the man who had been handing them information all along, Freddie Scappaticci. We only have to be lucky once. The Brighton bombing. Perhaps the most iconic moment of the Troubles came in the autumn of 1984. The British Conservative Party's annual conference was taking place in the south coast town of Brighton, with the main members of Mrs. Thatcher's cabinet, including herself, staying at the Grand Hotel. IRA man Patrick McGee had been able to gain access to the hotel by staying there 4 weeks previously over the weekend of the 14th to the 17th of September under the false name Roy Walsh, and had concealed a large bomb with a long delay timer near to the best suite in the house, in the bathroom of his room, number 629, near to where the PM and her closest colleagues would no doubt be staying for the conference. McGee had been in Pyra since returning to Northern Ireland in 1972, having been interned at Long Kesh between June 1973 and November 1975. The planned operation was said to be in retaliation for Mrs. Thatcher's stance against the hunger strikers of 1981. On the evening of October 12th, Mrs. Thatcher was just finishing off her paperwork before turning in for the night. She was very much a night owl, running on as little as 4 hours of sleep a night. At 02:54, the entire Grand Hotel was rocked by a huge explosion that devastated a large portion of the building. The huge bomb that had been planted very close to Mrs. Thatcher's room, it is estimated that had she finally gone to the bathroom of her suite instead of finishing off that last bit of paperwork, she would almost certainly have been killed in the blast. The then Employment Secretary Norman Tebbit was injured, and his wife Margaret was left paralysed for the rest of her days. In all, the Brighton bomb claimed 5 lives and 34 injured, bringing the total of those killed in the conflict to that date to 2,655. The now Lord Tebbit said later of that night and his wife's condition, "She was transformed that night. I could never forget that she was wheelchair-bound and extremely severely disabled. I know it brings a tinge of joy to some people who still crave for the old ways of violence, but there we are." But in classic Maggie style, she was not put off or in any way deterred by the incident. If anything, it strengthened her zeal against the Republicans. Mrs. Thatcher even appeared outside the hotel in the aftermath of the blast, looking completely unscathed, with not even a speck of dust on her, and spoke to the assembled cameras. "And I had just turned to do one final paper, and then, it went off. My husband was in bed and all the windows went, and the bathroom was extremely badly damaged. We were very lucky." In the aftermath of the bombing, the IRA sent her an open message saying, "We only have to be lucky once. You have to be lucky always." A dark prediction, certainly. However, it would seem that luck would remain with Mrs. Thatcher, as the IRA would never again be able to get as close as they did to her on that night. When the rubble and wreckage of the hotel was examined, investigators found fragments of a Memo Park timer, the same type procured by the IRA's European and Libyan contact Patrick Ryan, whom we discussed in the previous episode. Later in life, in an interview, Ryan said that his only regret was that he was not much more effective. Patrick McGee would later be apprehended in Glasgow by the Special Branch, along with 4 other IRA members of his cell that were planning other bombs in England on the 22nd of June 1985. McGee would be indicted for murder, receiving 6 life sentences. He would eventually be released from prison under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement in 1999, but that is a story for the final episode. The growth of Sinn Fein and the Anglo-Irish Agreement. With the elections of Bobby Sands and later Gerry Adams to parliamentary seats, although they either could not or would not take them, came the opportunity for growing political power base for the Republicans. The most effective way they could do that, without taking their seats in Westminster, would be on local councils. But despite this, divisions remained. The IRA expelled several high-up members who claimed that funds were being funneled into politics instead of the armed resistance. The IRA thoroughly rejected the idea that they were about to be pushed aside in favour of playing the British at their own game. They were committed to violence. Martin McGuinness was quoted as saying, "We do not believe that winning elections or winning any amount of votes will bring about freedom in Ireland. At the end of the day, it will be with the cutting edge of the IRA which will bring them down." Nowhere was support for the armed resistance more fervent than in the border county areas, particularly South Armagh, a place the British forces nicknamed Bandit Country. A place of rolling hills and miles of wide-open rural areas that the terrorists knew like the back of their hand and could create virtual killing fields out of nowhere for any detachment of British forces unlucky to get caught out in the open and unsupported. The arms that the IRA were able to acquire were hidden in caches all over the countryside and could be accessed at a moment's notice. Many attacks on British personnel would be conducted in this manner. A cache would be set up and its location given to the active cells. The Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985 was a deal that would give the Dáil Éireann a say in Northern Irish politics, in somewhat of a similar vein to the failed Sunningdale Agreement of 1973. The Southern Irish Parliament would hold an advisory role, but this time explicitly stated that the political stance and constitutional position or control of Northern Ireland would not change until such a time as a majority of Northern Ireland's population voted for it. A consensus-devolved body would be set up to oversee the governance of the territory. Maggie Thatcher had attempted to broker a deal before with Irish PMs Jack Lynch and Charles Haughey, but although this had resulted in the Anglo-Irish Intergovernmental Council in 1981, the massive upheaval from the hunger strikes had thrown all of this into turmoil, and the council was quietly dissolved. It did also not help that Charles Haughey had taken Argentina's side during the Falklands conflict, making relations between the two governments fractious at best. The agreement was signed on the 15th of November 1985, 1 year to the day before the birth of yours truly, in Hillsborough Castle, County Down, by Mrs. Thatcher and then Irish Taoiseach Dr. Garrett Fitzgerald. This agreement would offer far greater security liaisons, as well as a greater role for the Irish government in the region. This latter part, of course, was to try and head off any resistance from the Republican camp. The moderate nationalist John Hume, who had argued for Éire to take a greater role in Northern Ireland, saw this as a great victory for the peace process. Dr. Garrett Fitzgerald addressed the assembled press at the official signing ceremony. Nationalists can now raise their heads, knowing that their position is and is seen to be on an equal footing with that of the Unionist community. Mrs. Thatcher added her own thoughts to the historic document. Dr. Fitzgerald and I have signed a serious and solemn agreement which signifies the way ahead in relation between our two countries, and towards peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. In the immediate aftermath of the signing, Unionists were in uproar, as they saw the unprecedented way in which Éire now had a say in the governance of Northern Ireland, which they saw as a huge betrayal of their interests, and that Westminster was backing down in the face of Republican pressure. Many rallies were held decrying the agreement, burning the Irish tricolour, and calling for a more robust defence of the Union cause, something which had been conspicuously lacking from the Loyalist paramilitaries of late. Of course, the one voice that boomed out from the loud chatter belonged to the Reverend Dr. Ian Paisley, a man whose ear-shattering voice could bring down the very walls of Jericho, or make a drill sergeant run for cover. Paisley had, since the very beginning of the conflict, been the biggest and most popular Unionist mouthpiece, particularly amongst the more fervent and observant Protestants, for his invocation of the Almighty in his speeches. A particular speech he gave denouncing the Anglo-Irish agreement made very clear his thoughts on the Prime Minister, sharing a stage with an effigy of her, which was then lit on fire. "O God, defeat all our enemies! We call upon thee! We hand this woman, Margaret Thatcher, over to the devil, where she might burn, not to blaspheme! And O God, in wrath, take vengeance upon this wicked, treacherous and lying woman! Take vengeance upon her, Lord! The Unionist people are thoroughly committed to the destruction of the Anglo-Irish agreement. No surrender!" And during another mass rally, "Where do the terrorists run to for sanctuary? To the Irish Republic! And yet Mrs. Thatcher tells us that the Republic must have some say in our province. We say, never! Never! Never!" Paisley even threatened to form an open paramilitary army of like-minded Protestants to actively resist any attempt to rule from Dublin, the exact action that Loyalist leader Edward Carson had taken way back at the turn of the 20th century. It was obvious that Paisley had the numbers and resources to pull it off too. When asked about his intentions around this threat, he answered a press junket thusly: "Let us not bluff ourselves. We're on the verge of civil war in Northern Ireland. That's what we're on the verge of. It is the preparation of the people to be ready for the worst. And I can see I will be leading it. I am not abdicating my responsibility." When reminded that his words could be seen as bordering on sedition, a grave offence, Paisley doubled down, invoking the spirit of the early part of the century. Well, that's what they said about Lord Carson, and I'm quite happy to accept the charge. In the ensuing weeks since the signing of the agreement, the greater intelligence sharing of the two governments saw a great deal of arms caches recovered and seized, but this was a mere drop in the ocean compared to what the IRA fully possessed. By the winter of 1986, the IRA still had around 120 tons of various weaponry, mostly supplied by Libya, dotted in hundreds of locations around the border areas. The authorities were only merely playing a whack-a-mole with these dumps, with senior analysts concluding that the IRA were more than capable of continuing their violent campaign indefinitely. The IRA shifts focus. But in mid-October of 86, the IRA called an extraordinary meeting of the General Council. Of course, this involved Sinn Fein leaders too. This meeting would end with a monumental decision. The exponential growth of Sinn Fein had led to people like Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, confidence of their power base balloon to never-before-seen heights. The Republican newspaper An Vorblacht, meaning the Republic, declared the meeting to be an historic convention, and they were not wrong. Ever since the partition of Ireland in 1921, Sinn Fein had always boycotted taking their seats in the Dublin Parliament, seeing the Dáil as illegitimate as it did not have dominion over the entirety of the island of Ireland. But now the winds had shifted very much in their favour, and so it was agreed that, for the first time in 65 years, the policy of abstentionism in Dublin was over, and that Sinn Féin electees could take their seats in the Dáil, so they could better argue their case and put pressure on the UK Parliament by proxy. Adams said in a speech on the 2nd of November, "We have been down the road of feuding before. We will not go down that road again." This was a monumental shift in stance. Although the party still maintained their boycott of Westminster, it was still a very clear sign that the political wing was winning the argument, and it was now time for London to take notice. But if they didn't, the IRA would still have zero qualms about continuing the struggle through violence. However, the shift did cause some older members of the early years of the conflict to leave the party and the IRA, as they believed the military campaign would be wound down in the face of the political shift. Rory O'Brady was one such man. A person who had been there from the very start of the Troubles was now abandoning the cause altogether. Desmond Long was another who outright rejected the diktat, recalling of the meeting, "We were called to a meeting during the lunchtime on the Saturday, and they said, well, they began lecturing us, Adams, McGuinness and the Chief of Staff, and they were there to lecture us, and by J's now, we told them to F off. At that time, we were not accepting it. They had no intention of continuing the war." Clearly, Adams' declaration of no longer feuding was not exactly reflective of reality, but some saw the contradiction in direction as a way to develop a greater appetite for peace talks, which, although no one could have confidently predicted just yet, is exactly what would end up happening, but that was still very much a long way off. By the date of Adams' speech on the 2nd of November, the number of deaths now stood at 2,787. Tentative approach to peace and more Libyan aid. It turned out that people like O'Brady and Long were exactly right about the intentions of the IRA leadership. For months, Adams had been making clandestine representations via the Belfast priesthood to the leader of the Unionist Social and Democratic Labour Party, John Hume. In the letter that was sent to Hume, Adams stated his intention to open a direct and serious line of communication as a political alternative to the armed struggle. This laid Adams's cards firmly on the table. The Armalite was out, and the ballot box was in. Sadly, it would take another 11 years for a lasting peace to be realised. But in late 1987, the massive scale of the arms shipments that Colonel Gaddafi's regime was supplying to the IRA became public knowledge when a Panamanian-registered ship, the Enniskillen, was intercepted and its cargo seized. 20 surface-to-air missiles, thousands of AK variant assault rifles, 10 tons of various ammunition, and a large amount of Semtex plastic explosive were just some of the highlights of this seizure, more than enough to keep the IRA going for a long time. One could be forgiven for thinking that this was a major coup for the authorities, but it was a mere drop in the ocean. They subsequently learned that 4 other vessels had recently managed to deliver their cargoes undetected. I will let you do the maths on that, but suffice to say, you could arm a small country with what the Libyans had given to the IRA. 1 week later, the IRA would put their Semtex to use as they used 40 pounds of the stuff to bomb a Remembrance Sunday memorial rally in Enniskillen. But this bombing was unlike the others that had gone before. Even a lot of staunch IRA men balked at the idea of bombing a Remembrance Day parade. The bomb had been manufactured in Ballinamore, County Leitrim, and transported to Enniskillen, where it was placed inside a sports bag, inside the reading rooms, beside the cenotaph, thus confounding the security services who had swept the route of the procession and found nothing suspicious. It was time to explode at 10:43, 10 minutes before the ceremony was due to begin. The intended target was members of the Ulster Defence Regiment of the British Army. The explosion blew out the gable end of the reading rooms building, burying bystanders in rubble and showering others with masonry. 11 people died and a further 63 were injured. All were civilians. One more man would die 13 years later, having never woken from a coma. The attack was widely condemned by all sides, including Sinn Fein, and did an untold amount of damage to and severely undermined the armed cause. The IRA stated that the attack was in retaliation for an incident the week before, in which the RUC had clashed with mourners attending the funeral of slain IRA volunteers Eddie McSheffrey and Paddy Deary, during which the RUC officers had been spooked by a 3-gun salute fired over the men's coffins before their committal. The police officers had charged the crowd with batons and even fired less than lethal plastic bullets into the mass of people. The commotion led to one of the coffins being knocked off his stand and falling to the ground, damaging it, but thankfully remaining sealed. The senior members of the IRA Council stated that the attack was not sanctioned by them, and that it would be a mid-level officer and his subordinates in the Northern Command who had acted unilaterally. The IRA even went as far as to officially apologise for the bombing, but it did little to assuage the anger. The round condemnation of the Enniskillen bomb led to the British and Irish Parliaments agreeing to an enhanced extradition treaty, making it far easier for Britain to extradite IRA members from Eire to face justice. Unionists get tougher. The formation of Ulster Resistance. But November of 1986 would see the birth of far more than just yours truly. It would see the realisation of Ian Paisley's threats as far more than just bombastic bluster. Thousands of DUP members attended a rally on the 10th held by Paisley to call for a new kind of counter to the Republican threat. Paisley had already backed and overseen the formation of the Ulster Defence Association, but now an even more radical and violent force was to come out of this rally, named Ulster Resistance. This rally was held at the very same place where Edward Carson had begun his active resistance, Ulster Hall in Belfast. The Lord Mayor of Belfast, Sammy Wilson, gave the opening speech at the rally, calling upon those assembled to be vigilant for anyone recording the event. Despite this, the event was filmed, but I guess that must have been an exception. He then followed up with these words: "We are here this evening to mobilise and pledge ourselves to prepare to withstand the force which is going to be used against us." The deputy leader of the DUP, Liam Robertson, followed up at the podium with, "Though none of the speakers here this evening is a commander of his body, we are satisfied, knowing as we do, those who are. They are in earnest and will do nothing to engage the displeasure and judgment of God, the dissatisfaction of our people, or bring dishonour to our great cause." Of course, the one that everyone wanted to hear from was Paisley himself, who certainly did not disappoint in his delivery and his promise to back the new group. "I make a personal appeal to you as the political leader in this province. I intend to give this movement of Ulster Resistance my undivided support. I will give it whatever political cover it needs. We have no other option. There is no other way forward. There is one thing that we need that I take on this occasion, the strategy of Maggie Thatcher herself. She says, to negotiate, you need a deterrent. Well, we're going to have a deterrent." Yet despite this obvious move of sedition and the fact that Paisley made no secret of his support backing and directing of Ulster Resistance, the British security forces were reluctant to touch him. This would have only served to ignite the powder cask that lay beneath the whole province. It would have been bad enough that they were having to deal with the IRA. To have stirred up the Loyalists to rebel would have also spelled suicide for Northern Ireland, and nothing short of martial law could have ever hoped to hold control. Leaving Paisley alone was seen as the lesser of two evils. Ulster Resistance grew rapidly in numbers, and very quickly a man named Noel Little was deputised to acquire weaponry for the group. After scouring around for contacts, he agreed to meet up in Paris with Douglas Bernhardt, a representative of a South African arms dealer. An agreement was thrashed out that cost the Loyalist group $120,000 for a shipment of Bernhardt's finest wares that was smuggled into Northern Ireland in late 1987. They were distributed amongst Ulster Resistance, the UDA and the UVF, although the UDA's share of the guns was intercepted almost straight away, with several cars stuffed with Czech-made VZ-58 rifles being stopped and seized. The UVF's cash fell into the hands of authorities soon after, but that still meant hundreds of automatic rifles and RPGs and explosives had found their way into the hands of Ulster Resistance and other Loyalists, and they were more than ready to use them. But despite his usual resolute resolve, once Ulster Resistance became more involved in supplying other paramilitary groups and the bodies started piling up, Ian Paisley suddenly backed off on giving them the political cover he had promised, even distancing himself from the formation of the group. More British collusion, and the UDA steps up the violence. On the 16th of March 1988, a lone gunman from the UDA named Michael Stone ambushed an IRA funeral at the Milltown Cemetery in Belfast with one of the South African supplied rifles and some hand grenades, with the express intention of targeting Gerry Adams, who was due to speak. Adams was not injured, but 3 others were killed and over 50 people injured. Despite Stone being from the UDA and that organisation losing their stock of new guns, Ulster Resistance had supplied him with what he needed for the attack from UR's main man, Willie Fraser, a man who had originally fought for justice for victims of Republican violence, but became radicalised after several members of his extended family were murdered. The Milltown Cemetery attack marked the first instance of the South African shipment of weapons being used, but it was far from the last. The influx of better weaponry gave the UDA's men under their leader Johnny Adair a huge confidence boost, as it was a significant upgrade to their previous armament, which had mostly consisted of shotguns, revolvers and pistols. Now they had assault rifles just like their IRA counterparts. Over the next several years, a plethora of murders and attacks would be carried out using these arms. On the 10th of May, another Republican was targeted by the UDA on Brian Nelson's orders from information passed to him by the Frew. This man was Terence McDade, an unemployed bricklayer and father of 2. He was shot and killed in his own living room whilst he was watching TV. The family had just put their 2 girls to bed when the gunman suddenly burst through the front door and opened fire. This was made all the more tragic when it turned out that the murderers were actually supposed to have been looking for Terence's brother, Declan, but they had gotten the 2 siblings mixed up. Perhaps the most controversial murder by the UDA came on the 12th of February 1989, when men acting on Brian Nelson's orders broke into the home of prominent lawyer Pat Finucane and gunned him down. Finucane had represented many IRA men's cases in court, but had also taken on Loyalist clients too. Perhaps his most famous client was Bobby Sands, whom he defended throughout the hunger strike to try and win political status. But it would appear that it was no secret that Finucane would one day be targeted. His wife Geraldine said that when Pat would go to the holding centre at Castlereagh to see his clients, the guards would slyly comment to the prisoners something to the effect of, "You should get a new lawyer, this one won't be around for too much longer." On the night of the 12th of February, 3 masked men entered the Finucane household on Fort William Drive in Belfast and shot Pat 14 times in front of his family before making their escape. It was known that Pat Finucane's 3 brothers were in the IRA, but the family insisted that Pat himself was not. However, the fact that he defended suspected IRA members in court was more than enough to mark him out to the Loyalist paramilitaries. It would later come to light that even the police investigation of the murder was interfered with by higher forces, with the senior investigator in charge of the case, Alan Simpson, being told in no uncertain terms to not bother looking too closely into things by the head of the RUC's CID branch, Wilf Monaghan. Not only that, but Special Branch had managed to find out the identities of all 3 killers within only 4 days, but this information, rather conveniently, was never passed to any other body. In 2011, after the facts about the UDA's collusion with British forces had become publicly known, the Finucane family was invited to meet with the then Prime Minister David Cameron, who formally apologised for the murder, although I doubt this came as any great comfort to them. The UDA, however, had become far too comfortable with their relationship with British intelligence bodies, as they had begun bragging about how great their information was to journalists covering the conflict. This relationship would be thrown into the open only 6 months after the murder of Pat Finucane, when yet another murder took place. Lachlan McGinn, a 28-year-old father who worked as a poultry delivery driver from County Down, was killed on the 25th of August. He was sitting in his living room at home in Rathfriland when, around 0100, gunmen smashed the front windows and shot Loughlin multiple times, then fled the scene. Loughlin's son Ryan recalled in a BBC interview the many instances of police and army harassment of his father before recounting the harrowing memory of the night his dad was murdered, seeing him stumbling into the kid's bedroom, bleeding, and watching him die right there in front of him. No wonder he struggled holding back the tears. But tellingly, with this murder, journalist Chris Moore, who was invited to a meeting with the UDA, who proudly boasted that Loughlin McGinn was not the innocent man he was being painted as by the press and his family. They showed Moore footage taken at either a police or military base that went through a series of photographs of suspected IRA members. Loughlin's picture was one of those shown. But the fact that the UDA had this footage was a clear indication that they were in collusion with the British security forces. Once this became public knowledge, the army made scapegoats of a couple of soldiers in the Ulster Defence Regiment, claiming that they had leaked the footage to the UDA. A few bad apples is how they put it. Of course, we would come to know that the entire orchard was in fact rotten. Many years later, in late 2022, when a public inquiry into the murder took place that admitted the links with the UDA, Loughlin's daughter, Grace McGinn, said to the press when the inquiry was concluded, "Whilst this settlement by the police and the Ministry of Defence offers some comfort, it will never forgive the actions of those who entered our home that night, nor the agents of the state who sent them to kill our daddy." In September, the IRA struck back at the establishment when, on the 22nd, it detonated a bomb outside the Deal Army Barracks in Kent, southeast England. The time-delayed £15 device had been placed outside the barracks music school of the Royal Marines, timed to detonate at 0822. When it did so, the whole building collapsed under the sheer force of the blast, killing 11 members of the Royal Marines Band Service and injuring a further 21. As the years ticked over into the 1990s, the UDA would gain even more infamy and even more weaponry, but that is best saved for the final part of this series that will see the eventual road to peace. By the end of 1989, the total number of those killed since the beginning of the Troubles stood at 2,966, but sadly, there would be even more to come before a lasting peace was realised. Legacy. As much as the 1970s had seen most of the deadliest violence in the conflict, the 1980s showed that the IRA were more than prepared to engage in a protracted war of attrition to break down the resolve of Westminster. However, whilst any other leader may well have blinked first and given in, Margaret Thatcher was an entirely different opponent. While it is undeniable that she was an incredibly polarising figure, both then and now, there is no denying that she was pretty much the only one with the strength of character to weather the storm that the IRA were throwing her way. Even the Brighton bombing that could so very easily have ended her life, still, she did not falter. And whilst you can absolutely criticise her for lying about not negotiating while doing precisely that, it is obvious that she would never have fully given in to their demands. Having said that, we cannot ignore that her bloody-mindedness led to the unnecessary deaths of the hunger strikers. One must realise that to have given in at that point would have led to a virtual political suicide. If she had flaked then, it would have been obvious that she could have been forced to repeatedly do so if the same tactic were tried again and again. Having said that, the hunger strikes did have the effect of turning more people towards the tentative yet promising political solution to the conflict. This would slowly grow and flourish as the years drew on. But as the final decade of the century dawned, support for violence was beginning to wane, and before long, the Republican appetite for armed struggle had almost definitely run out of steam. It was time for a workable, lasting peace solution to be explored, and that is where our third and final episode will take us. But seeing as the previous episode ended on a musical note, I thought why not this one too. So once again, please welcome back to the channel my mate Mally Scott, a Northern Irishman himself, to give a rendition of a song penned by none other than Bobby Sands, called Back Home in Derry.
In 1803 we sailed out to sea, out from the sweet town of Derry, for Australia bound. If we didn't all drown, the marks of our fetters we carried. In rusty iron chains we cried for our wains, our good wives we left in sorrow. As the mainsails unfurled, our curses we hurled at the English and thoughts of tomorrow. At the mouth of the foyle bid farewell to the soil, as down below decks we were lying. Oh, Doherty streamed, woken out of a dream by a vision of bold Robert dying. The sun burned cruel as we dished out the gruel. Dan O'Connor was down with a fever. 60 rebels today out for Botany Bay. How many will reach the receiver? Oh, I wish I was back home in Derry. Oh, I wish I was back home in Derry. We cursed them to hell as our bow fought the swell. Our ship danced like a moth in the firelight. White horses rode high as the devil passed by, taking souls to Hades by twilight. 5 weeks out to sea, we were now 43. We buried our comrades each morning. In our own slime we were lost in the time. Endless night without dawning. Oh, I wish I was back home in Derry. Oh, I wish I was back home in Derry. Van Diemen's Land is a hell for a man to live out his whole life in slavery, where the climate is raw and the gun makes the law. Neither wind nor rain care for bravery. 20 years have gone by, I've ended my bond. My comrades' ghosts walk behind me. A rebel I came, I'm still the same. On a cold winter's night you will find me. Oh, I wish I was back home in Derry. Oh, I wish I was back home in Derry.
Thank you for watching this video. I do hope you found it informative and interesting. If you did, please hit the like button and consider sharing it with a friend to help it spread further into the ether. Subscribe to DID and check out my back catalogue for even more fantastic documentaries like this one on all aspects of the dark side of history. What did you think of today's topics? Let me know in the comments, as I do so love to read what you all have to say. If you wish to do so, you can support DID on Patreon or become a channel member to help support everything I do. Or if you wish to give a one-off donation, you can do so via the Super Thanks button. Or if you would like something more tangible for your support, you can check out my store to grab yourself some swag. A huge thank you to my current supporters, both new and the old guard. All of you keep me striving for more. And don't forget to check out my alternate channel DID Reads to hear even more beautifully narrated content. Then in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I shall see you on our next descent into darkness.